Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Kimberly Adams, a member of the Board of Governors here at the National Press Club and a host and correspondent at the public radio program Marketplace. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Headliners Newsmaker with entrepreneur and author Kara Goldin. We are happy to accept questions from our audience today, and I'll ask as many questions as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. That's headliners@press.org. Each year, InStyle magazine publishes its list of 50 badass women, women who, as InStyle puts it, are leading the way toward a better world. Last year, the list included environmental activist Greta Thunberg, network news anchor Norah O'Donnell, singer and activist Lizzo, and our guest today, Kara Goldin, an entrepreneur who disrupted the beverage industry with flavored water. Her company, Hint, is now the largest independent non-alcoholic beverage company in the country with annual sales approaching $200 million. But the path to success, as any entrepreneur will probably tell you, is not easy. It's a mix of hard work, grit, luck, and timing. Kara Goldin chronicles her particular journey in her new book, Undaunted, and through her podcast, Unstoppable. As Miss Goldin says in her book, if the opportunities I want are not coming to me, I'll have to create them for myself. Today, we'll hear more about how Miss Goldin left the well-trodden corporate path to found her own company with $50,000 and an idea for a naturally flavored, unsweetened water. Miss Goldin, welcome to the National Press Club.
Thank you.
So Hint Water started long before the pandemic, but can you just talk about what the last few months, 6 months, gosh, it seems like forever ago, almost a year, have been like at your company?
Yeah, absolutely crazy on so many levels, not only for me, but obviously for the entire team. I'm based out of the Bay Area in San Francisco, and in many ways, our team has always worked remotely. We have a lot of people who are living all over the country that were, working for Hint prior to this. But I think overall, everybody just was a little surprised at what was going on in the world. But I think that the key thing that people really noticed, and in many ways we were a little ahead of the mark, was that everybody really started focusing on health and trying to stay healthy. And I think drinking water or drinking a product like Hint has just done, is just the right thing for most people to really kickstart that the healthy living.
Yeah, so many people are focusing inward at this time. Can you talk a little bit about this book and why you decided to write this book about your particular journey?
Yeah, so the company Hint is 15 years old now, and I was a tech executive, had been actually working out of the DC area for kind of commuting from San Francisco for many, many years for a company called AOL. And when I decided to leave AOL and try and get something a little more local to San Francisco, I was looking around for that real perfect tech job when I stumbled upon this issue that I was really trying to solve for myself, which was, really focused on health and what I was putting into my body. And I never really thought about it before this moment when I was having some really bad skin issues. I had gained a bunch of weight after having multiple pregnancies. And my energy levels were just really, really decreased. And that's when I was paying attention to things that I was putting into my body, mostly food initially. And then one day I was looking down at my diet soda and wondered why I was giving a diet soda the pass, that was fine because it was called diet. And that's when I saw all of the ingredients in my diet soda and really decided maybe I should swap that out for plain water. So I did that. I swapped it out for plain water, and my skin issues were resolved. My energy levels resolved. I lost over 20 pounds in 2.5 weeks, just from giving up my diet soda. And the only challenge that I had was that plain water for me was just super boring. And I just wouldn't drink it all day. It was like a chore. And I thought, I don't know how long I'm going to be able to really stick with this. And so I sliced up fruit and threw it in the water, thinking, oh, wow, this actually gets me to drink water. And that's when I thought, if this product was in a bottle, maybe I would actually, drink this all day long. And I was shocked to see that no one was actually putting still water in a bottle with fruit with no sweeteners in it. And so I decided to create it.
And it seems to have taken off for sure. But this book is partially about your business, but also about your journey as an entrepreneur. And I mean, the title itself, Undaunted. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're hoping that people will get about out of this book about what it's like to be an entrepreneur, to be a woman entrepreneur, to be a working parent entrepreneur?
Totally. Yeah. So, I mean, the book is called Undaunted, Overcoming Doubts and Doubters. And clearly, I didn't have experience in the beverage industry. I had never worked at one of the big soda companies or a food company. And so, when I had this idea to help myself, drink water that tasted better, I really just, I started doubting myself that I could even do this. I mean, I went to my local Whole Foods that had just opened in the Bay Area and thought, gosh, it'd be, great to find this product first. And then I couldn't find it. And then I thought maybe I should just develop it. And then, an idea that sounds great. But then when you ultimately think, okay, well, I don't have any experience. I, really have no idea how to actually get a product on the shelf, or how to actually, keep it shelf stable, or how the distribution works, or any of those things. That's when I really just decided, if I just go try and see how far I can get, then maybe along the way I can start searching it out and try and get a little bit more help. And so, what I realized in that journey was, something ultimately that I think there's no better message for today, which is, I saw this problem. I really wanted to fix it. I felt like maybe I could make a couple of steps in order to see whether or not this was a viable opportunity or not. Never did I think that I could actually build the company that I've built today. And, not only did I see how it was, really helping myself get healthy and my family get healthier by not, drinking all of these drinks that had so much sweetener in it, but also, the number of people who have reached out to me over the years and said, this product is helping me drink more water. This product is helping me control a disease that I have, like type 2 diabetes, which is becoming more and more prevalent. Or, the latest, especially this month with October being breast cancer awareness, we have a lot of people who have reached out to us and said that Hint has really helped them to mask the metallic taste that you get while going through chemo. And when I think about, that this just started with an idea and a problem in my own house, right? And how just by developing something that is really, a mission-driven company that helps people to ultimately get healthier, not only did I have all of these doubts, but I believe that how many times do people ultimately have, an idea for a problem? Maybe they think like, gosh, that would really help, but they just don't do it because they think, I just don't have the experience. I don't know how to do it. And they just don't go try. So my hope is that by just sharing my story and, my hurdles and my fears and maybe even some failures along the way, that people will be inspired to ultimately just go and do what they were a little afraid to do, but then ultimately see that, well, if she can do it, I can probably do it too.
You mentioned just a moment ago Whole Foods and how, like, and in your book, you talk a lot about how important it was to get into Whole Foods for your company and for your
Mhm.
growth. But you also acknowledge that Whole Foods back then was a very different company than Whole Foods today, which is owned by Amazon. And there was just this very interesting scene where you were developing a very personal relationship with stockists and managers while you were pregnant and able to make those personal appeals. And I wonder, as you think about the lessons that people can take away from your book, that's not the way it works anymore. So, how do people apply what you went through with a big company, a big distributor now, to the way that the business works now?
Yeah, it's interesting because 15 years ago, you know, selling your product online is a much more viable possibility than it was, back then. I mean, clearly, I was running the partnerships at AOL 15 years ago for shopping and commerce, but grocery was really just not developed like it is today. So I really believe that people can start small and actually, launch a store online initially. And again, I think like you just start somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't have to be in Whole Foods. I mean, I think there is still a possibility that you can get it into a Whole Foods, but I think that the key thing is getting it in somewhere and making sure that it's working, and then keep rolling that across to other opportunities. But there wasn't the opportunity to actually launch it online back then like there is today. And I think almost anyone can launch a store, and really test their idea with not a lot of money, just to see whether or not the consumer actually is interested in ultimately purchasing it.
Another company you talk about in the book is Starbucks. And I'm hoping you can tell the story about when you lost your business with Starbucks, because you had a very interesting takeaway from that.
Yeah, it is an interesting story actually. It was fun writing about it, and kind of thinking back on that time, because when I look at the timeline for building Hint, clearly that was a high point and a low point. And the high point was actually getting into Starbucks and getting into over 11,000 locations. We thought we had done all of our homework to sort of learn what was success. We were exceeding what we thought they had told us was ultimately success. But it's a lesson of that I share with entrepreneurs constantly, that you just never really know what ultimately will happen, because somebody sitting on the other side of the table also has business initiatives and goals that they're trying to make. And so that is the story that we experienced with Starbucks, where a year and a half in, they came to us and said, unfortunately, we're going to be discontinuing you, and that's going to happen next week. And they were doing it because they wanted to put food and sandwiches in the case, which had a higher ring than a bottle of Hint. And
And a
so,
higher return on their investment and things like that.
exactly. And so it was, bad news for us. It was clearly something that I wasn't prepared for in many, many ways. It was, we, in addition to being discontinued, we had 6 months worth of inventory sitting in our warehouse, which, because we use real fruit in our product, was going to go bad. So there was a lot, riding on this moment. And shortly after this occurred, we ended up getting a phone call from Amazon, and they were launching their grocery program. And at that point, we had plenty of inventory in the warehouse to make sure that we could stock them quickly. And that at that moment, we became one of the highest leaders in their grocery program. So they were selling lots and lots of Hint Blackberry, because we were able to give them product right away. And I think that the biggest lesson, a few lessons learned, which is when kind of bad, disappointing things occur, I always have viewed them as, you have to look forward, you can't look back, and things are going to happen, but you have to really use those lessons to actually move things forward. And it was interesting because the buyer at Amazon had said to us, gosh, I had seen Hint before, but I've been buying it every day at Starbucks. And so I fundamentally went back to the Starbucks relationship and thought, gosh, if we wouldn't have been in Starbucks, maybe that wouldn't have ultimately occurred. But in addition to that, I mean, Starbucks gave us a huge opportunity to be exposed to so many places throughout the US. And, now by going through Amazon, we ultimately had the opportunity to service so many of those people who, maybe weren't going to be able to find it in the local Starbucks, but they could go online and buy it at that point. And then ultimately, we were still available through Amazon, and love working with Amazon. But after a year, what we realized is that they're not going to stock all 26 of our flavors in Amazon, and also in stores across the country, they're not going to stock all of our flavors. So we decided to launch our own direct-to-consumer business, which is over 55% of our business today, which grew extensively during COVID. And so that the triangle there of Amazon, or of Starbucks to Amazon to drinkhint.com, I really go back to, the Amazon relationship and think that a lot of this probably wouldn't have happened if it weren't for that relationship.
One of the key themes of your book is sort of pushing through various barriers. And I'd like to ask you about a couple of moments that you highlight in your book from the sort of new perspective that many people have just in the last few months about barriers to opportunity and growth, particularly when it comes to race and gender in this country. And so early on, when you're talking about how you got those first jobs, and how you were sending out all of these letters and cold calling people, asking for interviews. And at one point in your book, you said you had lined up 70 interviews to try to make that jump from being a waitress to getting into the job of your dreams, even to the point of going on a lark to the headquarters of Fortune magazine in New York. But one of the things that jumped out at me was that you said that you offered in many of these interactions to cover the cost of your own airfare to go to these interviews. And as we think about access to opportunity, even at that early stage, I'm wondering in the last few months that as we think differently about opportunity in this country, how you think those sorts of moments, those touch points, have shaped your journey and what it tells you about how you talk to people with different access to opportunity now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key thing, I mean, first of all, no one told me back then that that was like the wrong thing to do. So I just thought like that's how you ultimately go out and get a job. You just go and tell them that you're looking. And I think, fast forward today, I don't think that that's too different. In fact, I think it's very similar, to many situations, even, whether it's looking for a job or raising money, when the message out there is that, there's no jobs, there's, no, like you can't go raise money during, a time when no one's meeting face to face. I think, a lot of people are going to think that. And so this is the opportunity to just be a little bit different and just get out there and ultimately, tell people like, here's who I am, and here's what I ultimately want to do. And I think that message today is so important. I mean, how many people maybe are even sitting there, maybe you're furloughed, or you've just decided that you're really not interested in doing what you're doing. I mean, why not just take this opportunity, to just really go figure out what you ultimately want to do and reach out, to people and say, I would love an opportunity to, get on a Zoom call with you and see if there's some kind of opportunity to do that. And, I think in today's day and age too, that it's, the world has kind of opened up as well to a much more virtual environment versus, the world isn't just your local oyster for finding an opportunity. I mean, think of how many different opportunities there are when you're not, limited to just geography, right? Like you don't have to get on a plane in order to go find a job, as I did. I mean, you can try and reach out to people and see if there's some kind of opportunity virtually as well.
Yeah, but the access to opportunity point of it, I mean, there's been quite a bit of research and writing, especially in the last few months in the midst of these conversations about some of these barriers to entrepreneurship for low-income people, people from underrepresented communities in startups. And some of them are the ability to do unpaid internships or to travel or have access to those the resources that allow you to do that. In one part of your book, you talk about sort of reaching a really critical point in your business, and you were able to raise $500,000 from friends and family before you were able to then, and that gave you sort of leverage to go to these bigger investment firms to help you push your business forward. And in a lot of these underrepresented communities that you don't usually see in the startup scene, you can't necessarily go to your friends and family and do that. And I wonder how that shapes how you think about your own journey and what you think might need to change about the way that businesses get started to make that a more equitable process.
Yeah, I mean, look, capital needs to open up, obviously, for all, underprivileged communities. But I do feel like there's a lot more opportunities out there for people to ultimately do what they ultimately want to do. I think that the other piece that, I always talk to entrepreneurs about just in launching a product is that, there's this concept that you have to go and raise a lot of money and you're not even sure exactly what you're going to use the money for. So I always, share with people that like actually testing your concept and trying to get it out there as cheap as possible to actually see if it's a viable, opportunity is something that is super, super not only important, but I think valuable in that you're, showing people that this is something that is, a great opportunity and it's actually working. So I think that if you've got a business that is ultimately working and showing that there's consumers that are really, really interested in it, then I do believe that you can go out today and find capital. It may be harder to ultimately go find it. But I don't think it's just about finding venture capitalists or private equity firms either. I think that there are a number of people, individuals today that will invest. And I think it's just a matter of actually showing that you've got a viable business that is ultimately, already working. So if you, and really just I also just feel like that messaging too that's out there, I mean, that's just another wall that is preventing you from ultimately trying.
What
And
is
so
the wall?
that if you're saying that I can't ultimately go and raise money prior to ultimately going and trying to see whether or not this is a business, then I think that that is also something, that you don't know for a fact that you can't ultimately go and raise money if you haven't tried to figure out a way to actually show that this is going to work.
I don't have to tell you about the systemic barriers to women, particularly working parents who are women, in getting investment and getting access to opportunity, loans, and other things that may be more widely traditionally available to other business owners. What have you learned in sort of overcoming those barriers that you then think could apply to either systemic changes or individual changes to help broaden access to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's trying to figure out if you can show a little bit of progress prior to actually, going actually trying to go out and raise capital.
Mm.
Because I think today, can you go and start a business online? I mean, let's say that you want to go and start a food product or a beverage company. Can you actually? So many people that I've met come up with reasons why they can't do something because they aren't going to be able to get capital. They're, not going to be able to get into stores, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you can ultimately figure out a way to start small and show that it's going to work, I do believe there's capital out there that you can find.
A lot of the bigger investment firms and banks have launched new initiatives in this moment to reach out to more women, people from various underrepresented
Mm-hmm.
communities to increase access to funding. Any thoughts on those and whether or not they'll make a difference?
I think it'd be great if they would, right? But it's we'll see. We'll see whether or not they'll make a difference. I mean, I think that there are still angel networks that are out there. I think clearly there's more. There are more angels that are investing in women. I think where we are challenged, obviously, is in the later stage. So when people are trying to, in these underprivileged groups, that if they're trying to actually scale their businesses and they get it to a certain level, that it's harder and harder to find capital without getting into the venture or the private equity areas where that is challenging. But hopefully the banks will also be able to step in those areas too, because I think if you're actually trying to scale a company, unfortunately, you do need capital to scale. You do need to reinvest in the company in order to keep going. But I think that the most important thing is to be able to know that there's a lot of different options and really trying to understand what all of those are.
You've mentioned several times the need to sort of be keenly aware of what the consumer wants and how
Mm-hmm.
they'll react to the product that you have. And one of the things that's really become clear in the pandemic and a bit leading up to it is that a certain segment of consumers have a lot more demands on the companies they buy from nowadays in terms of what you're doing, in terms of social responsibility, in terms of their health, in terms of, even plastic use or something like that. Can you talk about how that sort of change in the retail landscape has shaped your company that kind of in some ways started with that idea?
Yeah, I think when I first started Hint, the it's fascinating. I mean, there were so many people who were industry experts that were sharing, don't actually share your story of why you started this company, because it makes it sound like too small, and that it was just this idea. And today, fast forward, I think that more and more consumers actually want to know who is the person or the people behind the brand and what problem were they ultimately trying to solve for. And I think that having that relationship with the consumers and being able to share different marks and how you're developing better products or better components inside of your company is absolutely critical. And frankly, it's a competitive advantage for entrepreneurs as well, because these large companies, typically the founder or the founding team is no longer around. And so it's really a connection that the consumer is really just able to make with not only that brand, but also what is the purpose, and how does that purpose ultimately transpire into meaning for the consumer.
And also, I think a lot of people are paying attention to how various companies and corporations are giving back within their communities. And you personally and Hint have adopted a mission: clean, safe, and lead-free waters in school, lead-free water in schools. Can you talk a little bit about that effort?
Yeah, and it's even expanding beyond that. At this point, I'm working on an initiative, actually, hoping to ultimately take this before Congress, but working on an initiative with Congresswoman Jackie Spears' office around clean water, which would expand into trying to eliminate and definitely measure PFAS in water. So I've learned a lot about
Sorry,
water.
just if you can explain what
Yeah.
PFAS is.
Yeah, so PFAS is PFAS. It's a chemical that is in our water supply, unfortunately growing in our water supplies, and it is a dangerous chemical that, according to the National Health Institute, as well as the Center for Disease Control, is a potentially cancer-causing ingredient that unfortunately ends up in our water supply and is very difficult to get rid of. And so through the years, I've learned, more and more about water and sort of what is in water. We actually remove all of that, obviously. Before we are producing our product, we use reverse osmosis and pasteurization and lots of things in order to make sure that we have clean water that we're ultimately making and selling. But it made me start thinking really about, the access to water in not only communities and obviously in schools that maybe are not going through the same processes like reverse osmosis and pasteurization. And so that's when I ended up getting in touch with my local Congresswoman Jackie Spear, and started talking to her about what ultimately could be done. And so we're trying to formulate a plan around that, which ultimately would not only test in schools, but hopefully also take this before Congress to try and create some laws that regulate not just lead, but also, as I mentioned, PFAS and some other ingredients that are in the water supply that currently are not being measured.
On the topic of schools, so many people are doing double duty right now as people working and doing their jobs full time while suddenly also monitoring remote schooling. And I think that a lot of people have a new appreciation for the juggle that working parents, particularly working moms, always manage, but it's particularly keen now with so many people trying to work from home. You're a mom of four, as I understand it. And I'm wondering, especially when you think about the title Undaunted and the fact that many people at the moment are feeling particularly overwhelmed being working parents and doing this juggling work, what you think that your story in particular and your life has in terms of lessons for people going through this now.
Yeah, I mean, I feel for working parents during this time, and clearly, it's. I think in many ways it's harder than what I was dealing with, which my kids were in school. My kids are older now, and my youngest is 15. So I cannot say that I'm dealing with the same things, even that many of my employees are dealing with having younger kids and having them homeschooled and trying to figure out that world overall. But I feel like, the one thing that I did learn along the way in building Hint is that you don't have to be in a hurry if you have an idea to, get it out in the world. I mean, there were clearly, when my kids were younger, there was a time when, I feel like around me, and there's stories in the book as well that I talk about this, that everybody was like, oh, you gotta like get it out in the world really fast, because people are gonna, like go out and do this, and they'll overtake you in some way, and then you'll fail. And I still wanted to be a mom and be home and go to my mommy and me classes with my kids in the afternoon. And I would be able to kind of make my time being an entrepreneur that worked not only for the business, but also ultimately for my family. And what I found, really in entrepreneurism is that if you actually can figure out what idea you ultimately feel, needs solving, that being a working parent and an entrepreneur can go hand in hand, and maybe it takes you a little bit longer to ultimately, grow it in a way that maybe if we weren't living during this time, or you didn't have kids sitting at home, that it would be easier. But I really, really do believe that entrepreneurism has the ability to be, much more flexible for parents than maybe even a traditional way of working.
You mentioned that many of your employees are dealing with this juggling aspect at this very moment. How has the pandemic changed the way that you operate as a business owner?
I think flexible time clearly is, from day one, when, we were really starting to see that not only were people, dealing with having to really do two jobs of handling their children, in many cases too, elderly parents as well, were clearly another issue. So I think it's also being flexible and being more and more aware to individual situation is definitely something that is, that we've seen, is just critical for leaders. I also just think, mental health is also just something that is really, more and more top of mind for not only our company but every leader that I've talked to, in terms of, this is a time that is really challenging. And if you've got kids at home and you've got, maybe elderly parents, or maybe even not so elderly, that are, away from you and you haven't been able to see them in a while, I think it's really just being flexible and looking at individual cases and making sure that we're all able to, work together and really, see what the individualism is that's really needed more than anything.
Uh, you speak to a lot of other business leaders for your podcast, Unstoppable, and that's been going on for a couple of years now, I believe. Can you talk to me about what you've learned sort of from other business leaders about entrepreneurship just through those conversations?
I think that the key thing that I've learned with entrepreneurs in every industry is that nobody really had it figured out in the beginning. There was no rule book. There was no, everybody had doubts. Everybody clearly had doubters saying that they, wouldn't be able to do it. Some of my favorite episodes, Amy Errett, who is the founder of Madison Reed, the hair color company. She's, clearly her story is very similar. And I feel like there are so many, male and female, where people have been able to really look at, not only are they focusing on what is the problem ultimately that needs to get fixed, but in cases where, a pandemic they had to make a critical shift during this time, they were able to do it because they, had so many challenges in the beginning. And even though they were growing prior to the pandemic, that they could go back to their roots and ultimately see, what was working, and really focus on that story as well.
How have those conversations changed in the pandemic, though? I mean, there's sort of the overarching idea of what it takes to be an entrepreneur, and a lot of the things that you've highlighted in your book and in this conversation. But is there any particular change in tone that you've noticed in the pandemic?
I think I feel like there was, especially with the entrepreneurs. I think most of the entrepreneurs that I was interviewing, I already had plans to interview them, and their businesses were growing, and it was a story of kind of how I built it, and definitely how well that they were doing. The interesting stories. One in particular is the CEO of one of my favorite nostalgic companies, Radio Flyer, Robert Passon. He tells a story of during the pandemic, as an example, they didn't want to miss building the wagons for the big holiday season coming up. And, they build everything in the US. And so they dismantled their factory and basically put components on everybody's lawn that worked in the factory so that they could continue to not stop and they wouldn't have any disruption in their supply chain. Like that wouldn't have been part of the podcast, right? I mentioned Amy Errett, her business, which she said that she used to almost brag about building or manufacturing everything in Italy, like it was hair care from Italy. And she said that come the pandemic, she knew that her supply was okay. It was a little tight coming from Europe, but she really wanted to make sure that if there was another wave, that she would have manufacturing set up in the US. So again, like the ability to sort of go back to the roots of the business and also stay scrappy. I mean, in the case of Radio Flyer, he's not the founder, his grandfather was, but he never lost his ability to kind of roll up his sleeves and kind of come back to the core thing. So I just feel like I don't know. It was just there. It's the most interesting stories, very similar in many ways to kind of the founding time that they were going through and what they were going through, even though they were a little bit later stage. So and really that started as a passion project for me, starting that podcast. I was just so curious about all these different businesses and how they were ultimately growing. But what I learned is that, really the core is that, they look at what's working and put the gas on that. They all have challenges. And frankly, they've all, had failures along the way. But the key is really learning from those failures and ultimately taking those to sort of, grow in the next era.
You were really approaching a key moment in your business just as we headed into the 2008 financial crisis and the recession that followed. What happened to your business in that time? And how do you think that maybe prepared you for this current economic crisis?
Yeah, we were at a point when, it was really challenging. We did not have the opportunity to really do direct to consumer the way that we are today. And we ultimately really needed capital to grow the business. And so, I won't give away the whole story, but we basically, bet our own shares on, the fact that we were making the right decisions and investing in the brand at that time. It wasn't a popular idea by any stretch, and it wasn't something that lots of people around us really thought was the right thing to do. But we thought if we can just go and invest in the brand, we were willing to risk it. And it's a interesting point in our history, and definitely something that was maybe a little risky, but it definitely worked out ultimately. And I think that it just goes to show you too, I mean, something that we were talking about earlier, that capital is even in a down recession, I do believe that capital is out there. You may need to knock on a few other doors. You may need to talk to your existing investors and potentially show them exactly what you're willing to risk. But I do believe that if there's a will, there's a way, and you have to figure out, how to ultimately get that.
That's just one of many risks that you lay out taking throughout the journey of your company in this book. But I just wonder what that does to you emotionally. I mean, do you ever have a crisis of confidence or did you ever have something where you were really doubting yourself, or the doubters and the naysayers were getting to you? And then how did you push through that?
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I think that the key thing is really recognizing when you ultimately have those doubts, and you get through them. It allows you during challenging times, to look back on those and think, I made it through that last challenging time, so I think I should be able to make it through this one too. And you asked this question before about, what I learned from 2008, 2009, and how that relates to today's challenges. And clearly that was there were moments when I thought that, gosh, this is really hard. I don't know how we're going to be able to do this. I don't really have any experience and trying to get through, this type of challenges. But I kept looking back to that time when we did, really doubt ourselves initially, but we did get through it. And I think that the more challenging times you have, and you can kind of tally them up a little bit, and then as you face new challenging times, you can go back to those times and really, celebrate a bit of what you have been through. And I talk about, another story in the book too, is a personal one with, my own fear of heights. And, it's been a real fear for many, many years. And how, if you challenge yourself once a year, you sort of put yourself into positions, even, before something kind of creeps up on you that challenges you. I think what you end up doing naturally is, maybe you're not going to have all the answers. You're going to have points where you're going to doubt yourself along the way, but ultimately you'll be able to go back to, whether it's a business challenging time or a personal challenging time, and say, those were times when I didn't know if I was going to be able to, do what I ultimately wanted to do or make it through. But I've done, 17 other times when I've been able to get through this. And I think that that's just a really, really valuable thing for people to recognize. And whether or not you just remember those times, or you journal them, or whatever it takes for you to really celebrate those times, I think it's so important.
One of the things that really struck me going through your book was just the vast variety of experiences you've had and how they all kind of have informed different aspects of your life. You talk about a job you took in high school working for former Senator John McCain, I believe, before he was a senator. Can you talk about your job interview for that, and then how that experience has kind of shaped how you operate in the business world?
Yeah, so I was in high school, and I, was living in Arizona, and John McCain was a bit of an icon back then, and so I thought, gosh, I really want to go and take a job with him, if I could get it. And so I went through a series of interviews, and the last interview, he was in the House of Representatives. He wasn't a senator yet. He interviewed me, and he said, okay, so why do you want to work for me? And I said, okay, so here's the deal. My parents are Republicans. And so I'd really, really like to figure out whether or not I'm a Republican. And he started laughing, and he said, that is the most honest, authentic response that I've ever heard. And I said, well, do I have the job or not? And he said, yes, you have the job. And so, as I continued to intern with him, and including through college, whenever he'd pass me in the hallways, he'd kind of chuckle, and he'd say, did I change your mind yet? And, it was always sort of this point of conversation along the way. And I think that, the one thing that we talked a bit about too is, there were points where I would actually go and ask him and talk to him about different decisions he had, made, contributed to, including the fact that Arizona did not recognize Martin Luther King Day, even though it was made a, national holiday. And I asked him why he had voted to not recognize it. And he said, Kara, sometimes, you have to agree to disagree with people and you can still like them. And I remember thinking, okay, what exactly does that mean? I still, did not believe, I did believe that John McCain was a super good guy. I didn't believe he was doing the right thing. And then years later, I think it was 2012, he ultimately changed his mind about that decision and apologized for what he had initially decided. It was at that moment where I thought, okay, well, sometimes it takes a little longer for people to come around to making the right decision, but I still, appreciated the fact that he was, open to discussion around something that maybe he just didn't see the light of day on quite yet.
I think that section jumped out at me because at this particular political moment, this close to the election and with the president that we have, there is a bit of this narrative about what it actually means to be a Republican in America today. And I was wondering if you thought that, well, I mean, I guess we know what John McCain said about this particular moment, but this kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier about the demands that consumers have on companies. That many consumers want companies to make a political stand. How do you juggle that?
Yeah, I worked on Michelle Obama's actually on her Drink Up initiative, and then actually worked under the Obama administration to grow entrepreneurism in a group called NACI at the end of the Obama administration. So I clearly look at issues that I think are really, really important issues for ultimately, to grow. Those are things that I believe in, but I think it's a challenging thing. I mean, I think obviously we're in a situation where there are even some Republicans and many Republicans that don't agree with our existing president, and so I think it's a complicated time. I think for me, John was always a person that was a super stand-up guy. He had issues that maybe I didn't agree with, including Martin Luther King, but I also believed that ultimately he would come around, and I think that that really is not the case for how I think many believe that this president is ultimately, viewing, or how people view him.
But specifically on this issue of companies almost throwing around more political weight than some members of Congress do at this point, how do you as a business leader make the decisions about, whether or not you're going to say something about Black Lives Matter or Me Too or voting in the election or something like that? How do you go through that process and decide what works for your company?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, we have taken a stance. Do I look at companies who are, not taking a stance on certain issues as wrong? I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily my place to make a decision on those things. I know what we've done on taking stances on these issues, but I think it's definitely look, as more and more information becomes available to consumers too, I don't think that you can hide either. And I think that you're almost doing more harm. It sort of goes back to speaking about, what we were talking about before about sort of, who's behind the brand and what ultimately they believe in. But I think I also believe that, at the end of the day, that just because somebody, I want people also to be healthy, right? Just because their political party might not be mine, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have access to clean drinking water or a product like Hint. So it's a challenging, time, I think, for everybody. But it's I look, I think more and more people are obviously more divided than we've ever seen it. And, I hope that, because I'm a Democrat, people won't hold that against my brand, right? But I mean, I think it's an important thing. And I think that it's something that people ultimately, as leaders, you need to make those decisions for yourself.
In the introduction to your book, you mentioned that you submitted this manuscript just before the pandemic. And I wonder how you think you might have written this book differently if you'd written it a few months later. And also, if you could talk a little bit about your editor.
Yeah. So we turned in the manuscript at the end of January, and I had two editors. Actually, my husband helped on editing, and then my editor John Butnam was somebody that worked very, very closely with me for the last 6 months to really get the book to be what it ultimately is. And so I had been writing the book for 4 years, and then asked an editor to come in and really help me hone it down. And unfortunately, in mid-May, he passed away from a heart attack, very unexpected. And so, it's something that it still frankly doesn't seem very real. As my book is coming out tomorrow, it's something that he became a good friend of mine, and somebody that I really admired, and somebody who really challenged me on many of these on many things that I wrote about that were obviously stories initially, that were things that as I had doubts along the way, he was asking me, but how did you feel about this? I mean, it was almost therapy in many, many ways along the way. So yeah, I was really, really, sad on many levels. But anybody who's written a book and who has had a relationship with an editor like I did, really, I think will appreciate sort of how I'm feeling about it, because it's somebody that not only is actually maybe taking down the words that you're using, but also really trying to kind of get to the meat of ultimately what is the messaging in it, that gets across. So thankfully the book was in a really, really great place, but I miss him a lot. And it's a very, very sad thing when anybody passes away. But I think clearly, during a time like this, when, you don't really get to say goodbye in the right way. And I had just talked to him the day before. So it's very sad.
We're just about out of time, and I wonder if you have any parting thoughts to share with people who either are entrepreneurs or would like to be, about remaining undaunted in the face of adversity on their journey.
I think that the key thing is knowing that if you can't ultimately go and do anything unless you go and try. So please don't put walls in front of yourself and say, "Oh, I can't do that because I don't have experience. I don't have the right education. I can't." Instead, figure out what can you do, and just start and try and figure out what are those tiny little things that you can do, and see if you can push forward a little bit more, and ultimately to get a little bit further.
Kara Goldin, her book is called Undaunted, Overcoming Doubts and Doubters. Thank you again so much for joining us today. And before I do, one last moment to wrap up, I want to offer some thanks to the organizers of today's event, headliners, co-team leaders, Donna Lenwan-Laguerre and Lori Russo, Club Communications Director, Lindsay Underwood, and Club Executive Director, Bill McCarran. Okay, and for my final question, what has been your favorite pandemic activity?
I would have to say hiking. So getting outside a lot more and really embracing nature.
All right, remaining undaunted throughout all of it. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.